Hey guys, Evrelia here. Welcome to my Affliction Warlock class guide. The reason that I'm making this guide is that a lot of people are struggling to do well as Affliction, and most of the time it's because they're not paying enough attention to a couple of really basic mechanics. I'm going to try and keep this snappy and to the point. I'm going to quickly talk about stats and gemming, then I'll jump right into how to play and finish up with some talk about talents and glyphs. Affliction has changed a lot. Despite the fact that it's the most familiar of the new Warlock specs, it's fun, not overly complicated, and has a lot of potential for high DPS. Okay, so as a general rule of thumb, consider stats in the following order of importance. First you have Intellect, then Haste at certain breakpoints, Hit up to 15%, Mastery, any extra Haste, and then Crit. Now to explain, Mastery is generally a better stat than Haste, but it can be worth reforging to Haste if you can reach certain Haste breakpoints. A Haste breakpoint is the level of Haste at which your dots gain an extra tick during their cycle. It's not an enormous DPS gain, but it is a small one and it's definitely worth doing in some situations. Now there are several, but the main two you'll be facing are 4198 or 4717. Now it's not worth reforging completely out of Mastery to reach the second breakpoint, but as long as you have more Mastery than Haste, it should be worth reforging to them. Hit is optional. In simulations, it shows that Hit is lower value than Haste or Mastery, but the reason for this is that the simulation can react to misses instantly, whereas in practice you would not. Having low Hit also means your DPS will vary more from encounter to encounter, which is not very practical, so I would advise getting close to the cap. Depending on your item level, you'll use one of two setups for your gemming, which you can see on screen now. The reason this changes is because Mastery becomes more valuable compared to Intellect the higher item level you get. Okay, so let's talk about how to play. Affliction's all about keeping your dots active and using Haunt to buff those dots at opportune moments, such as when you have powerful buffs or when the boss is weak. You can use this to control how much damage you do at certain times of the fight. Now there's two things that you need to understand about how dots work. The first is that you can recast your dots at any point when there's less than 50% of their original duration remaining. So for example, Corruption has an 18-second base duration, which means you can cast it at any point when it has less than 9 seconds remaining and you won't lose any DPS time. The other thing that you need to know is that dots do not update dynamically with your stats. So when you cast a dot, it remembers the exact stats that you had at the moment you cast it for its entire duration. So if you gain Intellect procs or Dark Soul, your dots will not benefit from them until you recast them. This is really important for Affliction DPS. Debuffs work differently though. They update immediately with any dots that are on the target, so if you haunt something that already has dots on it or Curse of Elements, then the dots will benefit immediately. Okay, so your basic priority system is really simple. You have 3 dots that need to be maintained: Agony, Corruption, and Unstable Affliction. Agony starts at 1 stack and slowly increases to 10 stacks over time. Corruption deals damage and has a chance to grant soul shards every time it ticks. You should always have your dots active on anything you DPS. Next you have Haunt, which is your main way to use soul shards. It increases all the spell damage you do to one target for 8 seconds, and you should use it whenever you have 4 soul shards or whenever your dots are affected by a powerful buff. Your filler spell is Malefic Grasp. This is a channeled spell that gives bonus ticks to your dots. You can start casting a new Malefic Grasp before your previous one is finished without any penalty. When the boss is under 20% health, your filler spell changes to Drain Soul. This deals bonus damage under 20% and also gives your dots bonus ticks, and every second tick of this spell grants you a soul shard. And then finally you have Dark Soul Misery. This is a self buff that increases your haste. Now remember, if you want this to affect your dots, you need to use it before you cast them. Dots that are already active will not be affected by this or any other buffs that you gain. Okay, so that's the basic priority system covered, so let's talk a little bit about how you would open up in a fight situation. So when the fight starts, you would always begin by drinking a potion of the Jade Serpent before you enter combat. Then you use Dark Soul and any unused trinkets that you might have, and then Soul Burn with Soul Swap. This instantly puts all of your dots onto the enemy, buffed with Dark Soul and any of the unused trinkets that you might have had. Since your dots are now buffed, you should apply Haunt to the enemy and make sure that it stays up for the entire duration of Dark Soul. Now you start casting Malefic Grasp. If you have any intellect procs such as Light Weave, Jade Spirit, or Trinkets, they'll proc now. Now remember, these procs won't be affecting your dots unless you refresh them, so as soon as they've all procced, throw out one Fell Flame to update your dots with the new effects. Okay, so from here on you need to refresh your dots as required. I try and react to intellect procs as much as possible. Normally I let the dots get very close to expiry before I refresh them. However, if I get an intellect proc, I'll refresh them as soon as they enter their refresh window. I'll use Haunts whenever my dots are buffed with multiple intellect procs. This gives you the greatest benefit from your Haunts. Do not ever use Haunt when you have no intellect procs or Dark Soul up unless you're at 4 soul shards. So your opener looks something like this. Is to keep high as uptime as possible on Haunt and keep your dots buffed with intellect procs as much as possible. Doing well as Affliction is all about stacking your Haunt with your intellect procs, refreshing your dots so that they benefit from intellect procs, and channeling Malefic Grasp as much as possible during Haunt. There's a couple of add-ons that I would definitely recommend that you use when you're DPSing as Affliction that I would consider mandatory for any Affliction Warlock. One of them is Power Auras, which displays all my intellect procs and Dark Soul buffs on my screen in an easy to see location, which allows me to easily refresh my dots whenever I get these procs and make sure that they get refreshed before these procs expire. Other than that, I have Class Timers, which displays my dots in an easy to see manner with timer bars going down. I use this for single target DPS. Other suitable add-ons for that are Quartz or Forte Exorcist. And then finally, Tidy Plates. Tidy Plates is very important for multi-dotting fights. This displays the dots above my target's health bar in the middle of the screen, or wherever the mob is positioned. This is absolutely essential for multi-dotting because it's the easiest way to see your dot timers on every target that you have your dots active on. Okay, so in Mr. Pandaria, talents don't offer direct DPS gains like they used to. It's all about making a utility choice and deciding what you need based upon the requirements of each encounter. So the first tier is all focused on self-healing. Harvest Life is great for bursty AoE situations where Seed of Corruption's ramp-up time is too long. So it's a valid choice on fights such as Fang Heroic. Dark Regeneration is a life-saving DPS cooldown, and when you pair it with the Health Stone, it's actually a lot of burst healing in a short space of time. But in any situation where you're not likely to need that cooldown, then the constant passive regen that you get from Soul Leech is the best choice to take. The next tier is focused on crowd controlling abilities. Howl of Terror is pretty useless for PvE, so that leaves you with Mortal Coil and Shadow Fury. Shadow Fury is great for any fights that contain stunnable adds, so Will of the Emperor springs to mind, it's really useful there, but it's not going to be providing any use on fights that don't have anything stunnable. Mortal Coil, on the other hand, provides a heal even if it can't CC the target, so you can use that against bosses, so that means Mortal Coil is going to be your talent of choice in most situations. The third tier of talents focuses on survival abilities. Soul Link, when used with a sacrificed pet, increases your max health by 20%, so that can be useful for a survival situation, but it doesn't reduce the damage you take at all, so it's not necessarily that useful compared to the other ones. Dark Bargain makes you immune to all damage for 8 seconds, but then you take half of the damage back over another 8 seconds. So it's a great survival cooldown, but it doesn't protect you against everything, but I personally could not play without it, so I really recommend taking Dark Bargain in this tier. The fourth tier of talents focuses on utility. Unbound Will allows you to break any movement impairing effects. Now that is mostly a PvP talent, but there could be specific boss abilities that it might help you to get out of, so don't always ignore it. Burning Rush, on the other hand, is great in a lot of situations. It's an amazing permanent sprint that will save your life a million times, so that's almost always what you're going to take in this tier. The fifth tier of talents focuses on pets. This is a DPS increasing tier. In most single target situations you're going to want Grimoire of Sacrifice because it's the highest damaging talent from this tier, but it doesn't do anything for AoE damage, or it doesn't buff your dots unless you're channeling on them. So the more you multi-dot an AoE, the less attractive this talent is. Now, if you were only AoEing or only multi-dotting and not doing any single target, then you would take Grimoire of Supremacy with the Observer Pet instead. Okay, and the final tier of talents, these are really unique buffs, and you really just have to take them on an encounter-by-encounter basis. Kil'jaeden's Cunning allows you to move whilst casting for 6 seconds without a penalty, or permanently with a cast speed and movement speed penalty. Now, it's an annoying talent because in most situations where you would want to move, the movement penalty messes it up and makes it kind of dangerous. However, any fight where you would want to move, it's pretty substantial DPS gain, so you should always consider that on high movement fights, unless it's going to kill you. Manaros Fury doesn't have much use in tier 14 at all. It's got some situational value, but there's not really any specific encounter where it's mandatory or even optimal. Archimonde's Vengeance is the default choice for any fights where you aren't moving, but the damage it contributes is insignificantly small, so it's not game breaking in any way.
If you found this guide useful, please feel free to have a look at some of my other point of view guides where I talk you through specific encounters, or my general raid strategy guides. You can also watch me live every day on twitch.tv/